Cars pass. People pass. This is where I live. I am here and I am listening. My hands listen. My skin listens. You are there and you are listening, I assume. When hearing with my skin, which happens from time to time, often in conjunction with hypnagogic or hyper-relaxed states, I become conscious of the body as a listening membrane. The skin's reactivity to sound is a relatively new field, at least from the scientific perspective. Receptors in skin are sensitive to airflow pressure related to sound, but I wonder at this. Having experienced sound as a mild passage of shock, passing over areas of skin in response to sudden sounds, could this also be an electrodermal reaction to auditory stimulus? Recent experiments indicate that sound creates a high electrodermal response when compared with other stimuli, speculatively connected to the startle reflex. The common idea is that music happens in the head as a swirling but contained and silent inner field of heard sound, contained within an outer sea of world sound, where it resonates and moves the body's frame and inner organs as with powerful bass frequencies. But there are other sensitivities at work, electrical and aerial, which span and connect these other polarized listening modes in a domain that is closer to touch and the related sensory wonders. Shiza from Okinawa. In and out, breath, respiration, lion dogs, guardians. When we work with materials as sounding objects, are we thinking about them as discrete clumps of matter, as sound vibrations without bodies, as fetish objects to be entranced by, as memory objects with long complex stories, or as assemblages whose meaning is constantly shifting between all of these states? The reason I ask the question is because of an uncertainty in my practice that has opened up like a void since the pandemic began. The feelings that had developed around the materials I work with just slipped away for a while, even though they surrounded me in self-isolation. Between the materials, the processes through which they enter the sound world, and listening in groups and in resonant spaces, continuity was broken. I have always been fascinated by the micro-audial. Those sounds so tiny, they seem to be nothing. Yet we can hear them, and they can affect us profoundly. There have been many opportunities to listen to tiny sounds in the past 19 months of solitude and partial solitude. But what interests me is the intimacy of shared listening. What I have described as the mediumship of the listener. A relatively recent model for this kind of listening exists online. ASMR, or autonomous sensory meridian response. A YouTube phenomenon which effectively annihilated the existing work on shared micro-audio listening. In the past, I've experienced on a number of occasions the tingle associated with ASMR, which leads me to think it's about intimacy and the comfort feeling that comes from close proximity to a particular kind of sensation. Objects and their surfaces, patina, texture, and history are wrapped up in this comfort feeling. But discomfort is a part of my world as well, and objects can carry uncomfortable memories. Here is a sentence from the Journals of Anais Nin, Volume 2, written in 1936. The first thing the spirits do when they enter a body is to unlock the eyes, as one might do to bad pictures. If you're working with different mediums, in my case, improvised music composed in the computer, instrument assemblages, writing, painting, then you think about the characteristics that link them, their properties and materials, and what states are involved in working with them. Personally, I think about the ways in which materials behave in a space, how spaces are created, internal and external rhythms, roughness and smoothness, a collision of events, densities, openness, emptiness, volume and intensity, the unfurling of a line and how long it can sustain itself. Shock or contrast, soft or brittle, hard or serrated sensations. I always hope there can be moments of humour and moments of stillness, emptiness after saturation, the volatile energies of vibration and resonance. Writing these last few lines at 8:45 in the evening, late July, sitting in the park, listening to ring-necked parakeets screeching at each other, I reflect on the fact that there is nothing special in any of this. It's simply a working of the experiencing of the world, the connectedness of these moments of sensation with emotional movement that seems to be inside and barely knowable. For me, this is what performance is all about, an exposure of this confrontation, an exposure in much the same sense that a photograph was exposed prior to the digital era, in which the process would begin in red half-light, and then a beam of stronger light would converge with chemicals and sensitized paper in order for forms to emerge into being and comprehension. To work with materials in whatever way is possible is a kind of salvation. In August, I made cyanotypes with my daughter and granddaughter, laying fibrous materials from my garden and sounding instruments onto paper sensitized with ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferricyanide. Blueprints, they were once called, because of the Prussian blue colour of technical and architectural plans that used this process. But it was a botanist, Anna Atkins, who in 1843 invented the technique of laying objects on the paper and exposing them to the sun. Her objects were algae specimens, and the resulting images became known as photograms. The suffix of this word, gram, derives from the Greek, what is written, something written or drawn, as in phonogram or cardiogram. As for blueprints, they are provisional, a plan rather than a realization. To work with the sound, weight, contours, texture, aesthetic and history of an object is to work with what neurologist Antonio Damasio calls the autobiographical self, with its astonishing capacity to recall so many different aspects of the object and objects like it. To quote Damasio, our past interaction, their shape, the typical movement with which we use them, the hand shape, and the hand motion required to manipulate them. The result of the action, the word that designates it, however many languages we know. On the sensitized paper of the cyanotype, I laid a Hmong shaman rattle from Laos. Its impression remains as a shadow of its former usefulness in the spiritual life and customs of Southeast Asia. The red ribbon and pitted, smooth, hand-forged bronze surface transformed into a whitish blue softness where sunlight barely reached the paper, like two iced donuts waiting to be eaten. Tactility of sound is strongly related to taste and gustatory pleasure. The shaman rattle is infused with its own memories, most of them opaque to me. They took place before I bought the rattle on a dusty street in Nong Kyo, Laos, within a practice of soul calling and spirit healing. My memories of being in Laos, hearing a similar shaman rattle in a Hmong village, and then the circumstances of the journey and what came afterwards. Those memories mix pain and pleasure. All of them are somehow inscribed in the rattle, absorbed by the feel of it in the palm of the hand and its sound, metal pellets tumbling about randomly in its interior grooves. But how this inscription takes place, I couldn't say. The two parts of the rattle fit over the fingers, so by moving those fingers, the pellets make their own decision about where and how to land. Sometimes I can fall into a kind of trance while doing this, listening and drifting with the indeterminacy of objects, striking the inside of other objects. This playfulness is not exclusive to humans. In her book, The Bird Way, Jennifer Ackerman gives examples of auditory experimentation by birds. Give a raven a jar or an empty flower pot, she writes, and it will put its head inside and listen to the sound of its own voice. It's the same sort of sensory play you see in kids. It's fun to talk into something that alters your voice. Some birds repeatedly drop objects and listen for the sounds they make. Galahs in New South Wales were seen dropping pebbles on the metal roof of a country house. Male spotted bowerbirds have been known to pick up shells from a heap and drop them on the pile 2 or 3 times, apparently just to hear a little tinkle. Another researcher, Millicent Ficken, writes about young garden warblers. One bird dropped a stone accidentally in a glass, making a ringing sound. All the other birds showed great interest, and many began dropping stones in a dish. In Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, Jane Bennett wrote about Charles Darwin and his reflections on worms as makers of history and protectors of objects, burying them beneath their castings for archaeologists to discover in centuries to come. Worms do not intend to enable human culture, she writes, but worms do, according to Darwin, pursue what appears to be prospective endeavours. His close observations of worms led him to conclude that worm actions are not the result of an unvarying inherited impulse, but are intelligent. Their improvisations, for example, in plugging up the mouths of their burrow with leaves, worms act in nearly the same manner as would a man. That is, they make apparently free, or at least unpredictable decisions based on the available materials. Though they usually seize leaves to be dragged to their burrows by their pointed ends, they do not act in the same unvarying manner in all cases, but adjust their techniques to the particular situation and its set of possibilities. Which leaves are available? Is the ground wet or dry? What other creatures are around? A worm writhing when exposed to light is a form of calligraphy, just as seaweed on a beach writes poetry in indecipherable script. Speaking about his famous photo book, Chizu, or in English, The Map, Kikuji Kawada sometimes spoke about sounds emanating from images. The starkly contrasted photographs in Chizu address the legacy of war and the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. But they are often what he called stains, surfaces written over with new markings by the unimaginable effects of the bomb's blast wave and thermal radiation. He spoke of exploring the ruins of the Genbaku Dome, stepping into a dark, cavernous room where he was shocked to experience an audibly violent whirlpool covering its ceiling and walls. I had the illusion that I could almost hear faint sounds merge with the wind and crackling sound coming out of the walls, he said. His collaborator on the project, Koei Sugiura, loved noise, he said. He described that noise as something very realistic, transfigured into another type of image. In his book Bubbles, Spheres 1, Peter Sloterdijk wrote about the human tendency to be sphere dwellers and the consequences of this tendency. That this interiority produces an auditory intimacy. It is the constitutive listening community that encloses humans in the immaterial rings of mutual accessibility, he wrote. The ear is the organ that connects the intimate and the public. Whatever else might present itself as social life, it initially comes about only in the specific width of an acoustic bell over the group. It is only through the arousing extreme development of the hearing that human existence within a sonospheric hothouse becomes possible. In the wall-less house of sounds, humans became the animals that come together by listening. Whatever else they might be, they are sonospheric communards. been given cause to reflect on those words during the past 19 months, separated but joined, close but distant, remote but intimate. Listening. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much.